headquarters of the Alliance for American Quilts. The Alliance is a national nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing the history of quilts and quilt makers. Thank you for being a part of Team Q.S.O.S. at the International Quilt Festival in Houston, Texas. This video will give you tips for conducting a QSOS interview. Whether you will be serving as an interviewer, a scribe, a greeter, a digital assistant, or a photographer during our time at Festival, having an overview of the entire process will help you understand how your job fits into the work of the whole team. This will also help if you decide to conduct QSOS interviews in your community, either by yourself on your own or by assembling your own Team QSOS. Quilters SOS Save Our Stories project volunteers and the people they interview find that QSOS interviews are enjoyable to do. Doing oral history interviews is a good way to meet new people and provide an exciting opportunity to learn new things firsthand about quilts and quilt makers. Each QSOS interview contributes to the Alliance's goal for the project: to document the story of today's quilt makers and their quilts, one conversation at a time. Each QSOS interview makes an important and unique contribution to preserving the history of quilt making in the United States. Let's walk through an interview step by step. As you heard in video 1 of this series, interviewees at Festival will arrive 15 minutes before their actual interview starts. This time will be used to check in with the registration desk, fill out forms, and hang up the quilt maker's touchstone quilt or object. Once the interviewee has completed their forms and the touchstone object has been hung up, it's a good time for the interviewer to ask the quilt maker if they have any questions or concerns. This settling in time, light conversation, and preparations for the interview can help break the ice and ease the transition to the interview itself. Be sure everyone in the booth has turned his or her cell phone to silent or off so you can focus on your conversation and the recording is not interrupted. The battery-operated digital recorders that we will be using will be set up on small tripods on the interview table. They operate with a simple one-touch button to record and pause, and another button to stop recording. The IT volunteers will be responsible for preparing the recorders in each booth before the interview begins and copying the recordings after the interview is complete. They will also be on hand during the interview if you have technical difficulties. With the quilt arranged so you can discuss it and your recorder ready, it's time to begin. After starting the recorder, you will be the first one to speak. Every QSOS interview begins with a standard opening announcement. Start the recorder and let it run for a few seconds. Then record your opening announcement.
Okay, my name is Alice Helms. Today is September 25th, 2011. I'm conducting an interview with Mary Kay Batay for the Asheville Quilt Guild Quilters SOS Save Our Stories project. We're at my home in Asheville, North Carolina, and it is 1:35 p.m. Nikki, tell me about the quilt you brought today.
This is a quilt that I made to...
This opening announcement and one for the closing of the interview will be printed on a card in each interview booth, along with a copy of the QSOS quadrant questions. You will use the QSOS quadrant questions list as a guide or loose agenda, but not a checklist. You can pick and choose from this list of open-ended questions, but don't feel tied to it. However, do try to ask questions from each of the 4 quadrants or sections so that the interviewee will tell you about the touchstone object they brought, quadrant 1, their involvement as a quilt maker, quadrant 2, their aesthetics and inspiration as a quilt maker, Quadrant 3, and the impact of quilting on their life and our culture, Quadrant 4. If it helps you structure the interview, you can devote around 10 minutes to each quadrant. Otherwise, let questions and conversation flow freely between the quadrant topics. Many QSOS interviewers find the Quiltmakers Touchstone Quilt to be a good place to begin the conversation with an open-ended question like, "Tell me about the quilt you brought with you today." After asking a question, it's time to be quiet and wait for a reply. Sometimes a few silent moments will pass as the quilt maker gathers his or her thoughts and decides how to answer your question. Silence is an important interview tool. Staying conscious of keeping silent after asking a question will help you feel comfortable with the silence and help you refrain from rephrasing the question or jumping in with another question. This may feel odd at first. Practice helps it become more like second nature. Once the conversation begins, pay close attention to the answers your questions receive. Close listening means really keeping track of what the quilt maker is saying and thinking about what you hear. Close listening allows you to develop new questions about the things the quilt maker is saying. For example, if you've just heard that the quilt maker learned quilting from her grandmother, you might ask, "What made your grandmother decide to teach you to quilt?" Or, "How did learning to quilt from your grandmother feel to you at that age?" Listening closely to the quilt maker's answers will help you draw out more detail and may prompt new recollections on their part that you can follow up with additional questions. Sometimes most of an interview will develop out of close listening and follow-up questions. And that's okay. Remember, you don't have to ask every question from the QSOS quadrant question list. The point of the QSOS interview is gathering some of the quiltmaker's stories and experiences. Letting silence work and close listening are important for developing comfortable and informative interviews. As you listen closely, it's also very helpful to listen actively. Active listening means indicating with your eyes and your facial expression that you are paying attention to what you hear. You listen actively when you nod in response to what another person says, or when you change your facial expression as new information is revealed. Active listening is also silent listening. And silent listening can take practice. Try to avoid saying things like, uh-huh, or yes, I see, yes, as you listen. Instead, nod your head, smile, and use your expression instead of your voice to indicate your attention. Active, attentive, and quiet listening and asking follow-up questions are all valuable interview tools, along with allowing a few moments of silence to pass now and then to allow the quilt maker to gather his or her thoughts. You may need to gather your thoughts too and shift your focus momentarily to the list of suggested questions for inspiration. It's okay to take a moment to refocus before asking a new open-ended question. The short silence gives you and the quilt maker a chance to shift mental gears. Sometimes during an interview, the quilt maker may ask you to pause the recorder. They may need to take a break or may want to share something with you off the record. Always respect the quilt maker's wishes when it comes to pausing the recorder whenever you're asked to do so. 45 minutes may seem like a long time for a conversation, but for many QSOS interviewers, it passes quickly. The exact length of each interview is hard to predict, but we ask all interview teams not to exceed 45 minutes for each interview. Each interview booth will have a small clock that you can glance at unobtrusively from time to time to help you know when your interview time is nearly finished. We could never know a quilt maker's entire story in 45 minutes, but this time frame is used consistently across the QSOS project. And in this case, it's important to stay on schedule. As you draw the interview to a close, it's a nice idea to ask the quilt maker if there were any topics you didn't touch on or things she or he would like to add before you conclude. The final step is to record the closing announcement. The closing announcement provides a sense of closure to the conversation. The closing announcement is very much like the opening announcement and is recorded just before ending the interview.
On your mind about quilting that you'd like to add to this?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Thank you
Very good.
for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mickey. And this concludes our interview. And it is now 2:07 p.m.
Then, turn off the recorder and relax. You did a great job! Thank the interviewee and escort them with their quilt into the photography booth next. You'll need to be sure to stay on schedule at this point, especially if you're scheduled for consecutive interview sessions. Now that you know what to expect as a Team Q.S.O.S. volunteer, it's time to do a little practicing. While it's not necessary to conduct a full QSOS interview before you travel to Houston for festival, it is a good idea to review the QSOS quadrant question list and try a practice interview with a family member or friend. This will give you a chance to practice close listening. Careful listening helps you determine the next question you want to ask, and active silent listening, how to respond non-verbally to the interviewee to indicate that you're listening. You can also use a practice interview to get accustomed to using silent moments to pace and direct the interview. It's not necessary to record your practice interview, but if you have the equipment and know how to use it, this can be a nice way to review your practice conversation and identify points for improvement. This video has presented information to help you conduct a recorded Quilters SOS Save Our Stories interview, a project of the Alliance for American Quilts. We hope you will use what you've learned here and the skills you gain at Festival to conduct QSOS interviews in your own community. Thanks for watching and listening to part 2 of our Team QSOS training series. You'll be contacted soon with confirmation of your volunteer schedule at Festival and information about a free question and answer webinar available to all Team QSOS volunteers coming up later this month. See you in Houston!